All right, Say good morning. Let us begin. So I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for today's shir. To thank Yoel and Sarah Kelman for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in appreciation for all of the learning and shiurim that come from the Kehila. To thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Howie and Chevy Friedman, for dedicating all of the learning today in the Zechus of Refuah Shlema for Howie's uncle, Yosef Shmuel Moshe ben Chaya Rachel, for Pesach Roshkovsky for dedicating the shir in memory of his mother, Rachel Bas Yehuda Tzvi Zichron L'Rachel, and of course in the merit of a Refuah Shlema for Aviva Bas Shena Chana, and for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah. All of those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Now, both with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Pei Aleph, 81. We have a lot to do today. We left off on Pei Amud Beis 80b. So we left off at the two dots, mamish like in the middle of the page. It's right across from Tosas. Ella bebeis minin. So the Gemara said over here as follows. Remember, the Mishnah introduced us to this fascinating idea regarding the making of an Eruv on Shabbos, and specifically also what happens in the event that the Eruv food diminishes. So what happens when the Eruv food diminishes? Halacha l'maisa, again, adding on to the Eruv food, adding on with different types, letting people know that you've added on, so on and so forth. So says the Gemara, Nitos v'alei and Mosif u'mezakeh. So we'll say halacha l'maisa, if more people joined the chatzah, let's say more people moved in, so what's the halacha? You could add on more Eruv food, and ultimately, again, you could mizaki means also you could convey ownership to the new residents, but in this case, the Mishnah said v'tzarech lodio. But here you have to tell the other residents about what has occurred. Because we'll say, obviously, addition of more residents and adding on more food is great. But Lamaisa now, Eruv only works if everyone is willing to share their food with each other. And the only way to know if people are willing to share their food with each other is if halacha lamaisa, you let them know about the addition of the new residents. Amrav Shizvi, Amrav Chista. Zos Omeres, this would seem to say, Chalukin alav chaverav Rabbi Yehuda. That Rabbi Yehuda's, his colleagues disagree with him. So the Gemara says, where do we see this now? Amrav Yehuda, when is this so? When is this so? Says the Gemara, the Tzarech Das. What is it that you have to have the knowledge of the other residents of the Chatzar? Says the Gemara, Be'eruv Tchumen. That's only about Eruv Tchumen. Aval Be'eruv B'chatzeros Ma'arvin Bein Ladas Bein Shlo Ladas. Also, when it comes to Eruv Chatzeros, you can make an Eruv Chatzeros on someone's behalf, whether they know about it or not. We discussed this a little bit in passing yesterday. We'll see it more today, based on the idea that the assumption is Eruv Chatzeros is always a zechus. Right? Eruv Chatzeros is always an objective benefit. Eruv Tchumen, remember again, is not always an objective benefit, as we discussed why. Because halacha l'maisa, by Eruv Tchumen, what you gain in one direction, you lose in a in a different direction. So therefore, again, Eruv Tchumen, you require the das of the person for whom you are making the Eruv. But Eruv Chatzeros doesn't require das. So pshita de chalukin, so obviously it's machlokes. So ma'adutem, what would you have thought? Hanimili b'chazar shemein shnei mavuos. I would have thought this is only like the case where you have a chatzar in between two mavuos. Aval chatzar shel mavoy echad emalo. But halacha l'maisa, I might have thought that the chatzar, just belonging to one mavui, does not require the knowledge of the residents. Kamash malon, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it does. Kamahu shiura. So we'll remember again how much the Mishnah then got into. How much food do you need? How much food do you need for the shituf muvaos, right? How much food do you need? So remember again, the Mishnah made a distinction between if you have a lot of people and if you have a small amount of people, right? So remember again, the Mishnah said if you have a lot of people, you need enough food, mazon shtei seudos, enough food for 2 meals. If you don't have a lot of people, then the Mishnah said, kigro geras l'chol echad ve'echad, the size of a dried fig for each resident of the chatzar. So it says the Gemara, kamahu merubin. We'll say when we say a lot of people, what's a lot of people? So again, right, the Mishnah says if you have a lot of people, the shear for the shituf is mazon shtei seudos. So what's a lot of people? Amrav Yehuda Mershmo Shmona Esrei Bnei Adam. 18 people. 18 people is a lot of people. Says the Gemara, Shmona Esrei v'sulo, just 18 people. Is that like a cap? 18 people. Ema mishmona esrei ve'elach. Rather, what it means is from 18 and up, that is considered to be a large amount of people. Umay shmona asar dinakit. So what's significant about 18? So Amrav Yitzchak, Breid Rav Yehuda, Ledidim mefarshili minei da'abo, kol she'ilam mechal kol amazon shtei sudos benehen, ve'ein maga'as grogeres l'chol echad ve'echad, hein merubin, v'sagi b'mazon shtei sudos. So let's listen to this. Interestingly enough, because why 18? 18 is the number where if you take the amount of food for 2 su'udos and divide it up amongst the people, that'll give a grogeres, that'll give the size of a fig for each person. For each person. Okay. Ve'ilo, hemuatan, and if you don't have that much, less than 18 people, is considered to be a small number of residents. Va'agav orchi kamashmalon, the shtei sudos havyan shmones grogros. And I will say, just by the way, the most teaches from here, you see that what? That mazon shtei sudos, the amount of food for 2 sudos, is also the amount of the same size as 18 dried figs. Okay, so therefore also what the Mishnah tells me is if I have 18 or more people, mazon shtei sudos. What's the significance of mazon shtei sudos? We'll say it's really the same shear. Because what did the Mishnah say? If you have 18 or more people, you need mazon or shtei sudos. If you have less than 18 people, you need the volume of a dried fig worth of food for each person. So the same thing. Because mazon shtei sudos represents the size of a dried fig for 18 people. The idea is once you get above 18, you don't need to start allocating that same amount for every single person. If you have less than 18, then it's the size of a dried fig for each person participating in the Eruv. Good. Says in the Mishnah, Bakol ma'arvin u'mishtatfin. Both say you can make an Eruv out of anything. Out of anything. Now both say, now we're talking about what type of food. See, in the previous Mishnah, we ended up with a discussion of how much food. Now we're speaking about what type of food. Now both say, now we actually already had a Mishnah like this when it came to Eruv Chatzeros. Right, and when it came to Eruv Tchumin, now we're talking more in the context of Shituf. So says the Gemara, Bakol ma'arvin. You can make an Eruv with anything, Umishtatfin, and make a Shituf with anything, Shituf Mavos. Chutz min hamayim u'min hamelech divrei Rebbe Elazar, except for water and salt. Water and salt cannot be used for Eruv Chatzeros, nor can it be used for Shituf Mavos. Divrei Rebbe Elazar, Rabbi Shua says, Kikar hu Eruv, afilu ma'afes sa'ah. Kikar hu eruv. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you have to use a loaf of bread. Loaf of bread has to be used. Says the Gemara. Now the Mishnah goes on. He says, Kikar hu eruv. Afilu ma'afes avu prusa ein ma'arvin ba. Kikar ke'isr v'hu shalim ma'arvin ba. Furthermore, the Mishnah says, even if you have a loaf that is very large, the size of a sa'ah, but Rashi says over here, so we'll say if you have a very large loaf and it's incomplete, you cannot go ahead and use that for the Eruv. However, if you have a very small loaf, but it is whole, then it is permitted to go ahead and use that for the Eruv. So we'll say, so now what the Mishnah says, that's all. So just to follow the progression. First statement is you can make an Eruv with, or a Shitov with anything, with the exception of water and salt. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you have to use a loaf of bread. And by the way, if you're using a loaf of bread, it has to be a whole loaf. It doesn't have to be big, but it's got to be whole. And even if you have a very large piece from a very large loaf, but it's a piece, halacha l'maisa, that's not going to work, says the Mishnah. Rather, it could be a tiny little loaf, but it has to be shalim. We'll see why that is. Says the Gemara. Now Rashi, by the way, just points out over here again, Rashi just links this to the previous Mishnah. In the previous Mishnah, we established that the minimum amount you need is the size of a dried fig. So halacha l'maisa, Rashi says you can have many small loaves, but there still must be at least the size of 18 small figs. Top of Pei Aleph. So the Gemara says, Tani nechada zimna bakol ma'avinu mishtatfin chutz min hamayim ha'melach. So the Gemara says, we already learned this before. Right? We already had this Mishnah before, that you can make an Eruv with anything, except for water and salt. So why the need to state it again? Amarabba la'afugim mit Rabbi Yoshua. This is to come to exclude the position of Rabbi Yoshua. The Amar kikar in midi achrina lo kamashmalon bakol. To which the Gemara says, you're right, but rather the Mishnah restates this in order to tell us that we do not paskin like Rabbi Yoshua. That as Rabbi Yoshua comes along and says, no, the only thing you could use for Eruv and the only thing you could use for Shitov is bread. Therefore, the Mishnah comes out with a sweeping statement. Not true. Bakol ma'arbin. You could actually go ahead and make an eruv with anything and everything, with the exception of water and salt. So the Gemara says, a svei orei zakasha, a svei abaye, bakol ma'arbin eruvei chatzeros, ubekol mishtatfin shitufim mevuos. In reality, Abaye says, you could go ahead and make an eruv chatzeros and a shituf muvos with any type of food you want. Oh, very interesting. The only time you must use bread is where? Eruv Chatzeros. Eruv Chatzeros. So for a Eruv Tchumen, for a Shituf Muvos, you can go ahead and you can go ahead and use whatever you want. However, again, for the Chatzar, you have to go ahead and use bread. So the Gemara says, Man shamas leida amar pas in midi achrina lo. So we'll say, 1 second. Who is the opinion who says you can only use bread and nothing else? That's Rabbi Yoshua. Right? That's Rabbi Yoshua espoused in our Mishnah. The Katani, bakol. And yet it says bakol. So we'll say, which one is it? Can you make an eruv with anything? Or is it eruv only made with bread? Ela amar Rabbi Bachana la'afuke mid Rabbi Yoshua do amar shleima in prusalo. Kamash molan bakol. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Rather, you should use bread. The Gemara is suggesting. Now we'll see what the halacha is, but you should use bread. But again, it's coming to exclude the position of Rabbi Yoshua. That whereas Rabbi Yoshua said that when you use bread, you must use an entire complete loaf. Kamash molan, we hold you don't have to use a loaf. You could even use a piece. Uprusa my time alone. So just as an aside, before we get to what we're asking, like, why is it that you can't use a piece? What is Rabbi Yehuda worried about? Rabbi Yoshua worried about in the use of a piece of bread? So the Gemara says, "Uprusa my time alone." This is actually very interesting. Rabbi Yossi ben Shol, Rabbi Mishum Eva, out of a concern ultimately again of animosity. Now, what's the Eva? If you look at Rashi, Mishum Eva, Sheboin Lide Machlokes, Sheomer Ani Nosin Shlema. Va'ata prusa. So we'll say it's very simple. What's going to happen if you're collecting food from everyone? So we'll say whether it's Eruv Chatzeros or whether it's not, this really doesn't apply so much to Eruv Tchumen as much, but Eruv Chatzeros, Shituf Muvos, everyone's contributing bread. And what happens? Reuven contributes a whole loaf. Shimon contributes a half a loaf. It's going to create animosity, right? One guy's going to get upset, I'm giving so much, this guy's giving so little, yet he gets to partake of my stuff. So in order to avoid any level of machlokes, so go ahead and make the contributions the same. Everyone gives a whole loaf. Now, while it's true, you have discretion as to the size of the loaf that you give, but lamaisa, everyone contributes a shalem. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rav Acha Rav Ashi, irva kulam beprusos mahu. So what about the following case? So we'll say, if you're concerned about animosity, what happens if you just collect prusos from everyone? Just let everyone go ahead and contribute prusos. So we'll say, obviously, if the whole idea of everyone contributing a shalom is what? Is to create uniformity and thereby avoid machlokes. So I don't think I could create uniformity with prusos also. Wouldn't that accomplish the same thing? You're right. That's true. Technically speaking, that would obviate the concern. But again, what we're just concerned about is it's much easier to create a uniform standard of shlemos than it is to create a uniform standard of prusos. Because at the end of the day, what still may end up happening is there still may be people who will contribute shlemos. And if there are people who contribute shlemus, complete loaves, and there are others who are contributing prusos, it'll just create that animosity. Therefore, the easiest universal standard to create, the Gemara suggests, according to Rabbi Yoshua, and this way to avoid any level of machlokes, is everyone contributes shlemus. Am Rabbi Yochanan ben Shol, nitla himene kedei chalasa ukedei dimua ma'arvin loba. Well, isn't this interesting case? What happens if you have a loaf? Okay, so you now have this particular loaf, and what's occurred? You remove from the loaf the amount for challah, or the amount for dimua. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, chalasa einach yisaron shezeh tikuna kadei dimua. So we'll say, obviously, removal of challah is understandable, right? You're making a dough, you remove a piece of the dough for the challah. Now remember, what happens if you bake a loaf and you forgot to remove your challah from the dough? So what do? You still take it. You just take it off the loaf. So now I had a loaf that was whole, but now I took off the amount for challah. Now, by the way, how much do you have to remove for challah? A very small amount. Very small amount. So let's say I have a loaf that was whole, but I removed the amount for challah, or I removed the amount for dimua. Now look at Rashi, it's very interesting. Im nidmas shenafla truma b'chulin, vasi imenu kikarzu, v'natla imenu dimua echa mimel tagna. Supposed to say if you have truma and chulin that get mixed together. So the halacha is, truma could be batal in a 1/100th, right? 1 to 100 ratio, 1 to 100 ratio. But we'll say, but what you do is you still remove some amount representative of the truma. That's called removal of dimua. Dimua means a mixture of truma and chulin. So we'll say, so in this case, interestingly enough, what's happening? So you're going ahead and you are removing something from the whole loaf. So in case 1, you're removing the challah. In case 2, you're removing the dimua. Now, what's unique about both of these things? A, you're removing a relatively small amount. But what's also fascinating about this? In this case, the removal of the piece is what allows the rest of the loaf to be consumed. So the shaila now is, how do you look at that loaf? Is that loaf a prusa, or is that loaf still a shalim? You'll say to yourself, well, it's a prusa because it's not whole. If it's not whole, it's a prusa. On the flip side, A, the piece that it's missing is very small, and B, it's the absence of that very piece that allows you to consume the rest of the loaf. So says the Gemara. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Shal nitla hemenach kedei chalasa ukedei dimua ma'arvin lo ba. So also Rabbi Yochanan says it works. You could use the loaf. V'atanya kedei dimua ma'arvin lo ba kedei chalasa in ma'arvin lo ba. But we learned elsewhere that if you remove the piece of a loaf, right, representing again the truma that got mixed in, you could still use that for the eruv. But if you remove the piece of challah from the loaf, right, and if you remove the challah from the loaf, halacha l'maaseh, you cannot go ahead and use it. So what's the pshat? So lo kasha, ha bechalas nachtum, ha bechalas balabayis. Oh, very interesting. Both say it depends on the loaf. One is talking about a baker's loaf. One is talking about a balabas's loaf. So we'll say, what does this mean? Rashi says, chalas nachtum, kitanehi ve'in. Let's see. Let's see. The Gemara says, what's the distinction? This nan. Here we go. Shir challah. We'll say, how much do you have to separate out for challah? Echad me'esrim ve'arba. 1/24 of the loaf is challah. That now, by the way, that is the loaf of a balabas. We'll say these are shiurim when the dinim of challah, real challah actually apply. Right? So again, 1/24 of the loaf. However, the Gemara says, Ose isa liatzmo. So we'll say, so that's talking about what? So fine. Shir challah echem esrim v'arba. Ha'ose isa liatzmo v'isa l'mishtebeno echem esrim v'arba. What's the 1/24th? So that's when you're making your own loaf. So if you're making a loaf of bread for yourself, or you're making a loaf of bread for your child simcha, so the challah is 1/24 of the loaf. Nachtum shu oselim karbashuk. So we'll say, but if a baker is making a loaf for commercial purposes, the isha sha'asta lim karbashuk, or a woman is making a loaf for commercial purposes, echad me'arboim ushmona. We'll say challah is 1/48 of the loaf. So we'll say, so now you begin to see the difference. So this is what it's saying over here. So challah. So remember again, so on one hand we have, just to follow the progression here, we have Rabbi Yochanan telling us that if you took dimua or you took challah from the loaf could still be used for the eruv because it's still considered to be a shalim. Then we have another brisa that says that if you removed kedei dimua, if you removed the meiser mixture amount, you could use it. But if you removed challah, you can't use it. So which one is it? If you remove challah, can you use it or can't you use it? To which the Gemara says, it depends. What does it depend on? What type of loaf you're using. Why does it matter what type of loaf you're using? Because depending on the type of loaf you're using is the amount of challah you have to separate. The challah of the loaf of a balabas, a private loaf, is 1/24. 1/24, the Gemara is suggesting, is a significant amount. And if you remove that amount of challah from the finished loaf, that is no longer considered to be a shalem and therefore can't be used for eruv. But if you're talking about a commercial loaf, a baker's loaf, and by the way, what the Gemara points out is that a baker's loaf doesn't just mean it's baked by a baker. A baker's loaf could also be what? A loaf baked by an individual used for commercial purposes. Right, going back a little bit to what we learned. So the idea is that ultimately, again, that type of loaf, That type of loaf is only 1/48 of the loaf for challah purposes. So 1/48 of the loaf is a very insignificant amount, a very small amount. The removal of that does not detract from the shalem status of the loaf, and therefore halacha l'maaseh could still be used for Eruv. Good. Amar Rav Chisda, this is an interesting case. Tafra b'kisem ma'arvin loba. Tafra b'kisem. So let's listen to this case. Look at Rashi. Rashi says Tafra b'kisem kikar shenifrasa v'tafra haprusas b'kisem near shlema. Watch this. I had a loaf that I was planning on using for Eruv, and then what happened? The loaf broke. So I have a great chap. What do? I pin it. Tafra literally means sew it. I've sewn it together with a piece of wood. So I'll say essentially what I've done is I took a toothpick, and I used the toothpick to reattach the two pieces of bread. So now I have a whole loaf again. So the shaila is that called a shalem or not? So the Gemara says, Tafra b'kisei ma'arvin loba. Halacha l'maaseh, if you went ahead and you put the two pieces together back with a toothpick, right? Kisei literally means a splinter of wood. That's called a shalem, and you could use it as for Eruv. But we learned elsewhere that you can't use it for Eruv. Lokashya ha dia tifra ha delo yedia tifra. So also the Gemara says it depends. Rashi says dia tifra nikar makom tirasa havi kapusa. If you could see that it's really two pieces put together by a toothpick, then halacha l'maisa, it does not work. But if you're such a good loaf seamstress that you could go ahead and put together the two loaves with the toothpick that you can't even see the seam, that's the idea. I guess seam is the right word. You can't see the area of the breakage. Then halacha l'maisa, it's a shalem l'gabi erev. Now, I'll tell you something very interesting. Just as an aside, we'll say the din of, so here, what are we talking about? What's considered to be shalem, right? We've established if you're going to use bread for an Eruv, although you don't have to use bread for all Eruvim, right? If you're going to use bread for an Eruv, then ultimately, again, one has to make sure that it's a shalem. So we're trying to figure out what's a shalem. So also we know that by lechem mishnah and Shabbos also, you have to have shleim, right? You have to have complete loaves. You don't have to be large loaves, you have to have complete loaves. So this is interesting, very clearly, there's an interesting shayla that comes up because we know that the halacha is that before you make hamotzi, you're supposed to score the challah, they call it, right? You're supposed to make a cut. So the Mishnah Berurah explains that the reason for that is because it diminishes the amount of time in between the bracha and consumption, right? So you want to minimize the amount of time between hamotzi and eating. So if you score the challah before you go out and you make hamotzi, you know exactly where you're going to cut, and it saves you, whatever it is, a couple of seconds in between the bracha and the hamotzi. So interesting. So sometimes what happens is when you score the challah, people could get a little too much zrizus, and you cut deeply. So there's a discussion in the poskim about if you cut, so scoring, mamish, what the Mishnah Berurah has in mind, it's mamish like a line, not cutting into the loaf, just cut just a little bit of a line. So what happens if you cut into the loaf? So what's the shaila now? The shaila is, do you have shleimim? For lechem mishnah? So Reb Shlomo Zalman Paskins, he says it's a very simple litmus test. He said, if you pick up the challah on one end, if the whole thing remains intact, then halacha l'maaseh, that's called shalem. But if you lift it up, and what happens? The other half falls down, right? Where you made the cut, let's say in the middle, right? And the other half falls down, so that's no longer shleim. So there's something to be conscious of, that if you score the challah, make sure not to cut it deeply. Really, it's just a little cut. This way you know exactly where to put the knife after hamotzi, because otherwise you run the risk of compromising your shleimim. Good. So says the Gemara, Amar Rab Zeira, Amar Shmuel, Ma'arvin pas orezu pas dochan. So Rab Zeira is the name of Shmuel, that you could use rice bread and millet bread for Eruv. So the idea is when we say bread, now remember again, it doesn't even have to be bread of the major grains. Right? You could even use rice bread, you could even use millet bread. I heard Shmuel's statement, I heard that what Shmuel said, no, is that you could use rice bread, but you can't use millet bread. Apparently millet bread was considered to be very inferior, so you can't go ahead and use that. So you could even use lentil bread. Is that so? That you could use lentil bread? So we'll say, but yet there was this lentil bread that they had in the time of Mar Shmuel, v'shaji lekalbe, and they threw it to the dogs, v'lo achla, and even the dogs wouldn't eat it. And I will say now, if the dogs won't eat it, that certainly speaks to the lack of quality of the item. So lentil bread was so bad that even the dogs wouldn't eat it. So I would say, so if that's the case, if something is so inferior that the dogs wouldn't eat it, how can you possibly use it for Eruv? To which the Gemara says, Hahi disha'ar minim havya. No. To which the Gemara says, no. That bread that the dogs wouldn't eat was actually, for lack of a better term, like a multi-grain bread, but not like a multi-grain bread made of primary flours, right? Made of primary grains. A multi-grain, look at Rashi for just a moment. Deshar minim hava, minin harbe hayu, me'uvravin ba, dahi vaday lav pasi. Dichsiv gabi yecheskel, va'ata karch lecha chitin uksiv, lechem anashim lo sochal. Ama lav lechem. It's actually very interesting. The bread that apparently they threw to the dog in the times of Shmuel and the dog didn't eat was a bread that was made of multiple grains. So apparently, again, the act of making breads out of multiple grains is something that creates a very inferior product. The Chsiv, we'll say it's actually interesting. It quotes over the pasuk from Yecheskel. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Yecheskel, "V'ata kach lecha chitin u'sa'orim upul va'adoshim v'dochan v'kusmin." So we'll say, so now Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Yecheskel, I want you to take grain and barley, pul adoshim are lentils, dochan millet, kusmin spelt, Vinasata, the rest of the pasuk is Vinasata osam b'kli echad. Put it all into one utensil. Vasis osam l'chad lechem mispayam sharta ashori al tzidka shlosh meos tishma. So the idea is, Kadosh Baruch Hu was telling Yecheskel to eat this inferior bread as a sign of mourning over the sinful behavior of Klal Yisrael. So the idea is Yecheskel makes this mixture of bread. And you see from here, the Gemara calls this that this was not lechem anoshim. Actually, Rashi quotes the end of the pasuk. Rashi says, or eksiv lechem, Chashbon tells Yecheskel, lechem anoshim lo sochal, that you should not eat the bread of man. So you see from here that this bread made of multiple grains. And I will say the mixture doesn't sound very good. Right? You could have, it's interesting because what's compromising the mixture over here is the introduction of not real grains. This idea of the lentil stuff and the millet. So if it was just a mixture of, let's say, the 5 primary grains, it doesn't appear that would be such a problem. But once you begin to mix in other types of grains, that's the moment that the quality of the bread is fundamentally compromised. So the Gemara says, Rav Papa Amar, Hahit Tzeluya B'tzuas Ha'adam Havi. Not only that, but Yecheskel went ahead and baked this bread on a fire that was made from human excrement. The Chsiv, V'hi b'gilali tzoas ha'adam ta'agen aleineihem. Ma'ai v'ugas so'orim tochlena. What does it mean when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yecheskel, and you shall eat it, ugas so'orim? What it literally means a cake of barley. What does that mean? Amar Rav Chisda l'shi'urim. So no, don't read it as Sa'orim, but rather read it as Shi'urim. If you look at Rashi says, V'ugas Sa'orim tochal na'am Rav Chisda, Hai Sa'orim lavdavka, da Hai shar minim tuvahavu. First of all, HaKadosh Baruch Hu called it Sa'orim. It wasn't just made of barley. Barley was one of the ingredients. Why would you call it barley? He said, don't read it barley, Ella, L'shi'urim tochlena, b'mishkal derech ra'avan v'lo l'soba. Rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling Yecheskel, you'll eat it l'shurim, you'll eat it in measured amount. In other words, that you'll eat it and you will not feel sated as a result of eating it. Rav Papa Amar, Arivasa ka'arivas so'orim, v'lo ka'arivas chitim. Kadosh Baruch Hu told Yecheskel, I want you to go ahead and eat it shaped like barley bread and not shaped like wheat bread. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so apparently, the way they used to shape bread of different grains in different ways, which I guess makes sense from a commerce perspective. I will say, remember again, so today, when you buy an item, you look at the packaging on the item and you can tell what it is. So like I said before packaging, what would happen? You have a bakery, you want to sell multiple types of breads. You don't want to spend your time explaining to people which one is wheat and which one is barley and which one is whatever. So what do? Apparently, they used to bake different types of loaves in different ways. So barley bread had a particular tzura, and wheat bread had another tzura. And interestingly enough, depending on the quality of the grain, was also spoke to the beauty of the shape. The beauty of the shape. So apparently barley bread, which was an inferior loaf, was also had a more inferior shape. a more inferior shape. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yechezkel, make the loaf like barley loaf. Good. So we'll say, so we know already that halacha l'maisa, certainly again, Eruv Tchumen, Shituf Muvaos, could Eruv Tavshil, well, Eruv Tavshil is a little bit different, because even though Gemara brought it up yesterday, could really be made with anything, Eruv Chatzeros, there is definitely the ideal of using bread. Definitely the idea of using bread. And if you're going to use bread, then halacha l'maisa, in the ideal sense, one is supposed to use shleimim. And that's in order to avoid the eva. That's in order to go ahead and avoid any type of animosity that could occur among the contributors. But halacha l'maisa, even for Eruv Chatzeros, other food items would work as well. Good, says the Mishnah. No sin adam ma'alechen v'ni ulenachtum. So let's listen to this. A person could go ahead, gives money, if a person gives money to a baker, right, or to a shopkeeper, kedei sheyiske lo eruv, in order that his money buys him a portion of the eruv. Now what's happening over here? Look at Rashi for just a moment. No sin adam ma'alechen v'ni. So we'll say here, a person is giving money to the shopkeeper who sells wine. So let's say, so just to illustrate the case over here, I live with Ruvain, and Ruvain and I live in the same mavui. We're making a shituf. I will say, again, it doesn't matter if it's a shituf or eruv chatzir, it's all the same idea. But here, Rashi illustrates it with a mavui. Ruvain and I live in the same mavui, we're making a shituf. Ruvain happens to be a shopkeeper. He sells wine. So what do? I give him some money. For what purpose? Kedei sheyiske lo eruv. Ultimately, again, in order to go ahead and buy myself a portion in the eruv or in the shituf. Rashi says over here, O nachtum, mocher kikaros v'da'imo b'chatzer, sheyiske lo be'eruv im chaverov, im yavo b'nei mavoy lekachas mimcha, kikar le'eruv, o yayin l'shituf yeli chelik bos. So what's happening over here? I say to Ruvain, listen, Ruvain, here's the deal. What's going to end up happening? The members of the chatz, the members of the shituf, we're going to both say, right now we're just going to use eruv in a generic term. Because it does not matter if we're talking about eruv chatzeros or shituf muvos, it's the same conversation. The point of here is I come to her and say, Ruvain, you live with us in the mavoi, so chances are the rest of the chevra is going to come to you for a barrel of wine for the shituf. Here's $10. And ultimately, again, when they come to purchase the barrel, let that $10 be my chilik in the shituf. So the Gemara says, Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, it works. The Chum say, Lo zachu lo ma'osav. The Chum say, no, it does not work. Now, why doesn't it work? Before you turn the page, look at Rashi. Lo zachu lo ma'osav. She'ein ma'os konos at shimshach. We'll say, listen to this. This is great. You're getting into some Baba Metzia Sugis now. So we'll say, Rabbi Eliezer says, Chum say it doesn't work. Why? Because we'll say, money can't acquire metaltalin. Right, when you give money does not acquire movable property. What acquires movable property? Some type of physical kinyan. Hagbah, meshicha, lifting something up, pulling it. But the actual payment of money does not acquire metaltalin. Therefore, the Chachamim say, when you go ahead and you pay Ruvain $10 for some chelik in wine, you actually haven't acquired anything. Look at Rashi. Shein mos konos ad sheim shoch. Va'afilu erev achen v'niazel l'chal achinu v'zika gam lo zeh. Eno erev shalon is kabin liskos of matnas chinam kishar mazakin be'erev ela liknos hama. Vare ina knu yelo the chayva the most in konos lo samcha daita dahai for lahavi daita like nu evinim sama arva ma'ozer shol b'dash. Listen to this. This is incredible. So what happens? What's the issue over here? So now watch this. I go to Ruvain. I decide, you know what? I'm being proactive. Right? I'm going to start to be proactive in life. I go to Ruvain. I say, Ruvain, I know the chevra is going to come to you. They're going to buy a barrel of wine for the shituf. Here's my $10 for the shituf. So sure enough, the chevra comes to Ruvain. Ruvain brings his barrel of wine. He makes a shituf muvos. The most remember again, we saw beforehand. So again, but let's say Ruvain decides to go ahead. You know what? The barrel's on me. So remember, what does Ruvain do? Ruvain then conveys ownership in the barrel to the members of the mavui. The problem now is I gave him money. So what is he going to do? He's not going to just simply give over ownership to me. He's giving ownership over to me on the basis of what? On the basis of the money I gave him. The problem is I can't acquire ownership in the wine on the basis of the money I gave him, because you can't acquire movable property with money. So therefore the Chachamim say, essentially, interestingly enough, my giving of money to the merchant in and of itself prevents me from acquiring my share in the Eruv. Umodim, Amud Beis, Umodim b'shar kala adam shezachu lo ma'osav. So both said this is very interesting. The Chachamim only disagree with Rabbi Eliezer in the case of where I'm giving money to the merchant. But if I'm not giving money to the merchant, I'm just giving money to another member of the Chatzar. Giving money to the member of the Chatzar, right? So I will say, and ultimately again, so let's say I go over to Shimon, I say, Shimon, listen, I'm gonna be out of town for the next couple of days. I know you guys are making an Eruv. Here's my $10. Let this be a portion in the Eruv for me. The Chum say, oh, that ultimately again will work. Look at Rashi. Umodin b'shar kala adam mefarish b'gemara balabayis sha'amar lo chavero helech ma'azu v'zachali be'eruv. Right? If I say to my friend, take this money and acquire for me a portion of the Eruv. V'halach v'zikalo shekana Eruv hoil de'ein balabayis ragel limkar kikaros lo niskavin ze'el lasoso shaliach v'naaseh ke'omer lo arevli. So listen to this. So therefore, the Gemara says, when I give money to my friend, I'm not acquiring anything. What am I doing? I'm making him my shaliach. So to make him my shaliach, ultimately again works to acquire a portion there. Suppose you hear the distinction. According to the Chachamim, when I give money to the chenveni, I'm effecting an acquisition. The problem is that acquisition is ineffective because money cannot create ownership over movable property. Ma'os einon konos. Money does not acquire ownership over movable property. Therefore, I will say it turns out that lemaisa, I can't acquire a portion of the Eruv because I was expecting, I'm relying on my money to acquire for me a portion. My money can't acquire for me a portion. But if I give money to my friend, who's not the chenveni, he's not the shopkeeper, he's not the baker, and I say, here's $10, get me a portion of the Eruv, that works. Why? Because he is now acting as my shaliach. And if he's acting as my shaliach, then ultimately, again, he has the ability to acquire a portion of the ear from me. Now, Rashi kind of gives us coming attractions. Rashi says, if you go over to the chenveni, and you say to the chenveni, be my shaliach, that of course will work as well. But the case that you're dealing with over here is, I didn't go to the chenveni asking to be my shaliach. Rather, what did I do? I'm purchasing something. Because you can only make an erah for a person with his consent. So again, we'll define exactly what that means. Well, look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Hilchach gabe chenveni kamerle zachili lo niskavin el liknos himenu v'lo samach alav shiyasa shlucho." So we'll say, here's what's fascinating. According to Chachamim, when I go ahead and I tell the chenveni, here's $10. We'll say, what am I doing? I'm looking to purchase something. What am I not doing? I'm not relying on the chenveni to act as my shaliach. See, I both say, this is what's fascinating. The relationship I'm entering into with the shopkeeper is a commercial relationship, is a transactional relationship. I'm not asking you to be my shaliach. I'm asking you to sell me something. So therefore, we'll say, this is why the Eruv doesn't work, because I can't acquire a portion in the Eruv like that. I can't acquire a portion in wine just through giving money. I'm dafka not asking him to be my agent. I'm asking him to transact a transaction for me. That is why it doesn't work. Umos in konos, Rashi says, v'lo samcha daite, nimtza ma'ariv lo shalom l'daito. Therefore, I will say again, even if the chenveni turns around and wants to go ahead and, so we'll say, you'll say, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, well, there's such an easy fix here. Let the chenveni just convey ownership of the wine to me. When he goes ahead and he brings the wine to the mavui, let him just convey ownership. Forget about the $10 I gave him. It doesn't work. Why? Because that's what it means. The fact that I paid money to the chenveni indicates that I want to acquire a portion of the wine. How? Through money. Not through conveyance. And therefore, because I want to acquire it through money, we'll say that prevents me from acquiring, because I can't acquire a portion in wine. I can't acquire a portion in any movable property just for the transfer of money. So we'll say it's this interesting thing where here I think I'm being proactive and think I'm going ahead and giving him $10, yet my giving him $10 ultimately prevents me from joining in the Eruv. So we'll say, so again, just to clarify, according to Rabbi Eliezer, this whole thing works. Again, we'll discuss the machlokes in the Gemara. The Chachamim say, if you go ahead and you give $10 to the chenveni, it's not going to work because ma'os einon konos. Money can't acquire movable property. Furthermore, again, at this point in time, even if the chenveni wants to say, Silber thought he was doing a good thing, you know what? Forget about the $10. I'm being makne you a portion in the sheetov, a portion in the Eruv. That doesn't work either, because I've made an express intent that I want to acquire through money. Well, once I've made that express intent, you can't do something on my behalf without my consent, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, I effectively can't join the Eruv, at least until I remedy it. When is this? So, Be'eruv Tchumen. Both say, when do we say when do we say that you can't make an Eruv for someone without their consent? That's only Eruv Tchumen. Aval be'eruv chatzeros ma'arvin l'daito v'shelo l'daito. L'fi shezach la'adam shelo b'fanav ve'in chavin la'adam shelo b'fanav. So we'll say again, when is it that you can't make an eruv without someone's consent? That's Rabbi Yehuda says, that's only eruv tchumen. Why? We've said this many times already, because eruv tchumen is a benefit, but it's also a detriment. It's a benefit in that it extends your tchum in one direction. Remember, whatever you gain in one direction, you lose in the other. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, when it comes to Eruv Tchumen, you cannot make an Eruv Tchumen without someone's knowledge. But something like Eruv Chatzeros, which is an objective benefit to everyone, you can make an Eruv Chatzeros ultimately even without a person's consent and knowledge. Again, I will say based on the principle, Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, you could do something objectively beneficial for someone even without their knowledge, but you can't do something even potentially detrimental without their knowledge. My time, Rabbi Eliezer, halo mashach. So I will say, I don't understand. Let's go back for just a moment. Rabbi Eliezer says, if I go over to the chenveni, I give the shopkeeper $10, I acquire wine for the Eruv. How does that work? How do I acquire anything? I never did Mashicha. Now, both say again, Commerce 101, Mekach Memkar 101. That's what? You can't acquire movable property through money. You require some type of formal kinyan. So halacha l'maisa, again, how could it be that I acquire a portion in the wine without any Mashicha? Most of this is incredible. Rabbi Elazar made Eruv like the four times a year. So we'll say, what's the pshat over there? This not. Here we go. So we'll say the bedalid prakim elu mashchitin es hatabach bal karcha. We'll say there are 4 times a year where halacha l'maisa you could force a butcher to slaughter an animal. We'll say under normal circumstances. So how would butchers work? So if I have a cow, and you come to me and you say, you know what, I'd like a steak. Okay, that's nice. Just bring 10 other friends. We'll go ahead and we'll slaughter the animal, because again, if you're a butcher, you don't want to slaughter the animal until you have buyers for the entire animal. Otherwise, you're gonna lose an incredible amount of money. But yet, there are 4 times throughout the year, the Gemara says, that we force the butcher to go ahead and shecht, even if he doesn't have complete orders, because it's a time 4 times a year where people need meat. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, "B'dala prakim elu perik ba'osav es b'no b'chulin." Erev Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach, so we're supposed to say right before Pesach. Erev Pesach, Erev Yom Tov Shel Atzeres, Erev Yom Tov of Shavuos, Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Erev Yom Tov Acharon Shel Chag, Erev Shmini Atzeres, the Erev Yom Kippurim Begalil, and Erev Yom Kippur in the Galil. So we'll say these are times where we force the butchers to go ahead and shecht, even if halacha l'maisa they don't have buyers for everything. Afilu shur shava elev dinar. Even if you have a shar that is worth 1,000 dinar, ve'enu lokeach ela dinar echad, and the lokeach only wants to buy 1 dinar of meat, kol finos alishchot. Ultimately, again, if you want to go ahead and if you force the butcher to shecht, it may, therefore I will say again, if halacha l'maisa, so let's play this out. I go over to the shochet, say to the shochet, you know what, here I want to buy $100 of meat. But yet what? The shar itself is worth $1,000. Therefore, in mace, if the animal dies, mace lokeach. Ultimately, again, I will say, who suffers the loss? The purchaser suffers the loss. So I was supposed to say, I go over to Ruvain. Ruvain is the shochet. I see shecht. Here's $100. I want to buy $100 of meat. The shor is worth $1,000. So what's that? At these 4 intervals, we force the shochet to shecht. That's fine. But after I give my $100 to Ruvain, let's say the animal dies before shechita occurs. So ultimately, again, who suffers the loss? I suffer the loss. So the Gemara says, Mesa lokeach. I suffer the loss. Halo mashach. We'll say, I didn't do Mashicha. I don't understand. If I prepay for the meat, so the Maisa again, halachically, I never did any kind of kinyan. I never acquired anything. So if I never acquired anything, if the animal dies before the shechita, then why should I lose my money? Amarav huna b'shem mashach. No, the case where I did Mashicha on my portion of the animal, or on the animal. But the Mishnah goes on and says, they both say throughout the rest of the year, in other words, the non-4 times of the year, if I prepay for a piece of meat and the animal dies, I get my money back because the loss is considered to be the butcher's loss. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, amai hamashach, dealing with the case of where there was Mashicha, she will say, once I do Mashicha, right, if I do Mashicha on the cow, I acquire my portion of meat. So if the animal dies before Shechita, I, the purchaser, should bear the loss. You're right. Ultimately, again, there was no Mashicha. I saw what happened over here. So we'll say the case over here is where Rashi says, Bishazichalo tabach lelokeach b'sharzeh shava dinar ayde acher shemasar ashar li acher va'amrlo zachar lo b'shem ploni v'hu lo aso shaliach laoso azocha b'shus. Let's listen to this. What's the case? The case is where Ruvain conveyed ownership to of the piece of meat to me through another party. So b'dalid prakim elu. So we'll say, now watch this. So now you see what's happening over here. Ruvain is conveying ownership to me for something that I did not ask him to appoint a shaliach and convey ownership. It's true, I gave him $100 for a piece of meat, but I did not ask him to convey ownership to me through another party of that meat. So watch this. B'dalid prakim elo dischusulo zachin lo shelo b'fanav. So we'll say at the 4 intervals where everybody buys meat. So Ruvain's appointing a shaliach on my behalf to acquire the meat is a schus for me, and therefore it works. However, b'sharimos hashana dechovulo, but the rest of the year where meat is nice, but lav dafka I'm going to buy meat. I didn't ask you to appoint a shaliach. That's not considered to be an objective benefit. The shaliach cannot acquire on my behalf. So the Gemara said, Rav Ila Rabbi Yochanan, Bedalid Prakim. Said Rabbi said, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that halacha l'maisa, maybe the reason, the same way that the butcher could appoint a shaliach to acquire something on my behalf at a time when it's clear that I'm going to want meat to Dalit Prakim. So maybe the suggestion over here is same way that halacha l'maisa, even though again when I give money to the chenveni for wine, and money doesn't normally acquire movable property, maybe what's happening over here is the chenveni is conveying ownership of the wine to me through another party. Maybe that's what's happening. Rabbi Yochanan, no. B'dalit prakim elu ha'emidu chacham divrei al divrei Torah. Dam Rabbi Yochanan divar Torah ma'os konos. So we'll say, watch this. So we'll say now we'll get through as much of this as we can in the last minute that we have. Rabbi Yochanan says, we'll say in the dalit prakim. Actually, no, we'll say we're going to stop over here. We're going to pick up with this in Miras Hashem tomorrow because it's actually a very exciting sugya. So we'll say, so just to understand what we're leaving off with. What we're leaving off with is, I don't understand the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Right? Rabbi Eliezer is telling me that when I give $10 to a shopkeeper, halacha l'maisa, again, I do acquire a portion in the Eruv. I don't understand that. Why? Because l'maisa ma'os einon konos. In general, we assume money does not acquire movable property. So how does Rabbi Eliezer say it does work? And Miras Hashem to be continued tomorrow.